Police radios crackle against the crash of Atlantic waves. June 30th, 1973. Virginia Beach. Cabin 16, Sea Pines Motel. 2 young women lie inside. One strangled, one shot 3 times in the head. No witnesses, no sign of robbery. No one heard a single scream. They were supposed to drive home that morning. Instead, detectives walked into a crime scene so clean, it looked almost staged. For half a century, the question echoed through Virginia Beach like a ghost. Who killed Janice Pietropola and Lynn Seathaler? And how did he vanish into the night? This isn't a story about rumor or myth. It's a story about evidence, buried for 46 years until technology finally caught the man everyone thought had disappeared forever. It started as an ordinary summer trip. 2 best friends, laughter, and the ocean breeze. But by the time the sun rose on June 30th, 1973, the calm rhythm of Virginia Beach would be shattered forever. Inside a small seaside motel cabin, 2 young women, both from Pittsburgh, both full of life, were found brutally murdered. No one had heard a sound. No one had seen a struggle. For nearly 50 years, their killer's name would remain hidden in plain sight. Janice Pietropola was 19. She worked as a secretary, quiet but independent, always careful and organized. Lynn Seathaler was 19 as well, her closest friend since high school. Lynn was the more outgoing of the 2, bright, adventurous, and full of laughter. Together, they were inseparable, the kind of friendship that seemed unbreakable. In late June 1973, the girls decided to take a short trip to Virginia Beach. It wasn't planned months ahead. It was a last-minute summer getaway before responsibilities pulled them back home. They wanted relaxation, sunshine, and freedom from Pittsburgh's busy energy. They packed light. A few clothes, some beach wear, and a camera. They borrowed Janice's car and hit the road, making the 350-mile drive to Virginia's coast. It was their first trip that far away without family, but they felt safe. Virginia Beach was popular, a friendly tourist spot, lined with motels, restaurants, and bars. They checked into the Sea Pines Motel, located at 19th Street and Pacific Avenue, just 2 blocks from the ocean. A small, family-run establishment, the kind where the owner knew every guest. Their cabin, number 16, was modest but cozy. 2 beds, a small kitchen, and a back door that opened to a quiet alley. Neighbors later recalled the 2 girls were polite and smiling. They spent their first few days swimming, sunbathing, and visiting local attractions. They wrote postcards to friends back home, went to the boardwalk, and even had dinner with a couple of acquaintances they met on the trip, fellow visitors from Pennsylvania. Everything about their stay was ordinary, uneventful, until it wasn't. June 29th, 1973. That evening, witnesses saw Janice and Lynn out together around 10 p.m. They were in good spirits, laughing, enjoying the warm night. Around 11 o'clock, they returned to the Sea Pines Motel. It was quiet there, families asleep, lights dim. They parked the car, walked back to their cabin, and went inside. No one saw them alive again. The next morning, June 30th, the motel's owner noticed something strange. Janice's car was still parked outside the cabin, but it hadn't moved all morning. That wasn't unusual for vacationers, except checkout time was approaching and the curtains were still drawn. Around noon, a housekeeper went to check the cabin. When there was no answer, she opened the door. What she saw inside would haunt her forever. The room was silent, but it told a story of unimaginable violence. Lynn Seethaler was found in the living room area. She had been strangled with a length of cord, her body showing signs of a brutal struggle. Janice Petropoulos was in the bedroom. She had been shot 3 times in the head with a small caliber weapon. Both women had been sexually assaulted. The back door of the cabin was open, forced from the outside. The air was thick, heavy, and still. The girls' suitcases were unpacked, their clothes folded neatly as if they were still planning to go to the beach the next morning. Police were called immediately. Virginia Beach detectives arrived to find one of the most disturbing crime scenes the resort town had ever witnessed. There were no signs of robbery. Money and personal belongings were untouched. The killer hadn't come for valuables. He had come for them. Officers cordoned off the area and began a full forensic sweep. But this was 1973, long before DNA analysis, long before computerized databases. Investigators had to rely on fingerprints, ballistics, and intuition. What they found was frustratingly little. A few partial prints, a broken lock on the back door, a .22 caliber bullet casing, no weapon, no witnesses. The motel staff and other guests were questioned repeatedly, but no one had seen anything suspicious. The killer had entered silently and vanished the same way. The story spread quickly through Virginia Beach and beyond. 2 young women from Pittsburgh murdered in their motel while on vacation. Newspapers called it the double slaying at the shore. Locals locked their doors that night for the first time in years. Back in Pittsburgh, the news was devastating. Both families were crushed. Janice's parents couldn't comprehend how their careful, responsible daughter could end up the victim of such brutality. Lynn's family described her as full of light. The idea that someone could extinguish that light for no reason broke them. Police began constructing a timeline. The girls had been seen alive around 11 p.m. The murders likely occurred between midnight and 3 a.m. No forced entry was visible from the front, suggesting the killer had approached the rear door. Detectives speculated that the killer might have watched them for days, someone who knew their routine, who waited for the right moment. They pursued leads aggressively. There were tips about a strange man seen lingering around the motel earlier that week. Others claimed to have noticed a suspicious vehicle near the alleyway behind cabin 16. But none of it led anywhere solid. The only physical clue was the .22 caliber shell casing, matching a small handgun commonly available at the time. Without DNA, it was like chasing a shadow. Weeks passed. The investigation slowed. Police compared notes with nearby jurisdictions. They wondered if it could be connected to similar crimes, unsolved murders or assaults involving young women. But nothing fit perfectly. Virginia Beach Police offered a reward. FBI agents were consulted. Forensic experts examined the evidence repeatedly, hoping for a fingerprint match, a ballistic trace, anything. It all led to dead ends. By the end of summer, the double murder case of Janice and Lynn went cold. Their families returned home to Pennsylvania with no answers, no closure. They buried their daughters side by side, their gravestones a few feet apart, carved with the same date of death. Detectives promised to keep the case open, but years turned into decades. Files gathered dust in the archives of the Virginia Beach Police Department. What made this case especially haunting was how random it seemed. There was no indication that the women knew their killer. No robbery motive, No personal grudge. It was as though someone had simply chosen them because they were there, because they were vulnerable. Cold case detectives, years later, would describe the scene as controlled brutality. Whoever did it, they said, wasn't acting out of sudden rage. It was deliberate, planned, executed cleanly. In the 1970s, Virginia Beach was growing rapidly, attracting millions of tourists each year. With that growth came transients, temporary workers, and drifters, people who could disappear without a trace. Police considered every angle: a local predator, a traveling salesman, even a construction worker staying nearby. But without physical evidence tying anyone to the scene, there was nowhere to go. As the years passed, the case file became just another folder in the archives labeled Unsolved 1973 Double Homicide, Seathala and Pietropola. For the next 40 years, the families could only wonder who had done it, why those two girls, and would anyone ever pay for what happened that summer night in Virginia Beach. Every year, detectives revisited the case, hoping new technology could uncover something the 1970s couldn't. But time worked against them. Evidence degraded. Witnesses passed away. Still, the case never fully disappeared. It lingered in local memory, whispered about among old police circles and true crime enthusiasts. Until one day, decades later, technology caught up with the past. For decades, the Virginia Beach Police Department kept the Seathala Pietropola file alive. Detectives retired, new ones took over, but every few years someone opened that beige binder again. Inside were black and white photos of the motel, hand-typed witness statements, and 2 pages of ballistic notes listing .22 caliber weapon, unknown make. The evidence was boxed, sealed, and moved from one storage room to another, waiting for a science that didn't yet exist. By the early 2000s, that science finally arrived. DNA profiling had transformed how investigators solved cold cases. Even the tiniest biological trace, skin cells, sweat, saliva, could now speak louder than any confession. Virginia Beach detectives began systematically reviewing their unsolved homicides, shipping evidence to the state for retesting. When the Seathala Pietropola box was opened, technicians found that several items had survived the decades surprisingly well: clothing, a towel, hair samples, and preserved swabs. A careful re-examination in 2018 pulled microscopic DNA fragments from one of the items associated with the sexual assault. The lab entered that DNA profile into CODIS, the national database. Weeks later, an alert flashed back. Match found. The name that appeared on the screen stunned everyone. Ernest Brodnax, a man who, at the time of the murders, had already crossed paths with law enforcement, but had slipped through every crack the 1970s could offer. Brodnax had been born in 1947 in New York City. By his mid-20s, he had drifted between jobs, construction, shipping, short-term gigs, moving often between New York and Virginia. He'd been arrested multiple times for burglary, assault, and attempted rape, but none of those cases stuck long enough to keep him off the streets. In 1973, records placed him in Virginia Beach for seasonal labor. After the murders, he simply left town. No one linked him to the 2 tourists from Pennsylvania. In 1974, he was convicted in New York of another violent sexual assault and spent years in prison. He was paroled, rearrested, and in later decades served more time for unrelated crimes. Each booking, each conviction added another entry to state databases. But it wasn't until the 1990s that DNA samples from inmates began being systematically collected. That small change, decades after the murders, would finally close the loop. When the match landed in 2018, detectives double-checked everything. Could there be contamination? Could the profile belong to another Broadnax? The lab confirmed the match repeatedly. The probability of error was less than 1 in a billion. Investigators tracked Broadnax to Queens, New York, where he was living quietly in his 70s, frail, grey-haired, and moving slowly with a cane. To neighbours, he was just Ernie, the old man who sat outside the apartment building smoking in the afternoons. None of them knew that he'd once been the prime suspect in one of Virginia Beach's darkest unsolved murders. Except he'd never even been questioned. In April 2019, Virginia Beach detectives traveled to New York with an arrest warrant. They coordinated with NYPD, approached Broadnax outside his home, and took him into custody without resistance. He said little, only asking why officers from Virginia wanted to speak with him after so many years. During interrogation, Broadnax denied everything. He claimed he'd never been to that motel, never met those girls, never set foot in Virginia Beach in 1973. But the DNA told a different story, one that didn't fade with time or memory. Back in Virginia Beach, news of the arrest spread quickly. For the families of Janice Pietropola and Lynn Seathaler, it was a day they'd imagined but never believed would come. Many of the victims' relatives had passed away. Those still living were in their 70s and 80s. They remembered the phone calls, the funerals, the decades of silence. Now, finally, there was a name. Detective Sergeant Tim Hatcher, who had worked cold cases for years, told reporters, "You could almost feel the weight of 50 years lift off this department." The case that had haunted generations of investigators suddenly had clarity. Prosecutors prepared for extradition. In 2021, after legal delays and health reviews, Broadnax was formally charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, rape, and other related offences. Given his age and health, the focus was simply ensuring the case reached court, so a record of accountability could exist before time took its toll again. The indictment brought renewed attention to how many cold cases linger in the dark, unsolved, not because the killers are clever, but because the tools of their time were too limited. In 1973, detectives had only fingerprint cards and typewriters. In 2019, they had databases linking states across the country and the power to read genetic code from a trace of skin. That bridge of technology closed the gap between 2 eras, the analog past and the digital present, and in doing so gave 2 young women their names back in the story of justice. Journalists revisited the timeline, piecing together what likely happened that night. Broadnax, working nearby, may have spotted Janice and Lynn during the day. He'd committed similar assaults before, using a pattern of stalking, breaking into lodging, and attacking when victims were asleep. At the Sea Pines Motel, he likely watched until lights went out, forced the back door, and acted swiftly. The precision and violence matched his earlier known crimes. Afterward, he vanished north, unnoticed amid thousands of tourists leaving the beach that weekend. As detectives walked reporters through the evidence, one detail struck them most. The original investigators had preserved everything so carefully that, decades later, modern scientists could still extract DNA. That preservation, old envelopes, sealed bags, signed evidence labels, had kept justice alive. Without it, Broadnax's name would have remained buried. Family members expressed quiet relief rather than celebration. "Nothing brings them back," one relative said, "but at least the truth is written now." They thanked the detectives who never let the file die, the scientists who found the match, and the public who still remembered the girls from Pittsburgh who never made it home. Broadnax's health deteriorated while awaiting trial. In 2023, the court declared him mentally incompetent to stand trial due to dementia and advanced illness. Legal experts debated whether he would ever face a jury. But for investigators, the DNA link was definitive. There would be no other suspect, no other explanation. The case was effectively solved. Virginia Beach police closed the Seathala Pietropola file after nearly half a century, marking it cleared by arrest and identification. For cold case units around the country, it became a model. Proof that meticulous evidence handling and patience can outlast even the longest silence. Today, Cabin 16 at the old Sea Pines Motel no longer stands. The building was torn down years ago. New structures line the block where tourists still walk to the beach, unaware of what once happened there. But the story of those two young women remains part of Virginia Beach history, a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, and that justice, though slow, can still arrive long after the waves have washed the footprints away. When detectives closed the Seathala Pietropola file, the sense of relief inside the Virginia Beach Police Department was quiet but profound. The case had been part of the department's DNA. Every new cold case detective had learned it first, studied the photos, the typed reports, the diagrams of Cabin 16. Now, for the first time since 1973, the margin beside the victims' names could finally read, "Solved." Reporters filled the press room the morning the announcement went public. Chief Paul Newdigate began simply, "This case has haunted this department for nearly 50 years. Today, we can finally give these families a name." On the screen behind him, two photographs appeared, Janice and Lynn, smiling in their summer clothes, followed by a third image, the mugshot of Ernest Broadnax, age 80. The contrast was devastating, the faces of youth and the face of time. The press release summarized the science, the timeline, the arrest. What it didn't capture was the quiet work that had made it possible. Detectives cataloging ancient evidence, lab techs slicing microscopic fibers, clerks cross-checking serial numbers on decades-old evidence envelopes. Each detail mattered. Each decision, especially those made by the 1973 investigators, had preserved the chain of custody that modern science needed. The family's response. When officers delivered the news to relatives in Pittsburgh, some wept, others simply sat in silence. Lynn's sister described it later. "You dream about this call, but when it comes, it feels like standing in two different years at once, 1973 and now." Janice's cousin said the identification didn't erase the pain, but restored dignity. "They aren't just names on an old newspaper anymore," she said. "They're part of a solved case." Both families released short written statements thanking investigators and scientists. They asked for privacy, declining television interviews. Their focus, they said, was gratitude, that someone had refused to forget. Inside the department among detectives, the case became a symbol of persistence. Cold case investigator Tim Hatcher kept a copy of the original crime scene diagram pinned near his desk, even after closure. "Every line on this page used to be a question mark," he said in a department interview. "Now we can finally draw the last line." The case also changed how the department handled evidence. In 2020, Virginia Beach PD began a full inventory of every homicide file prior to 1990, digitizing reports, scanning photos, and listing every physical item still preserved. They established a separate climate-controlled evidence vault for long-term storage of biological material. The Seathala Pietropoula case was cited in the internal memo as the reason for the upgrade. Broader impact. The story drew national coverage not just for the arrest, but for what it illustrated: the power of forensic patience. Across the country, agencies began re-evaluating old sexual assault kits and homicide evidence with new low-copy DNA methods. The National Institute of Justice referenced the case in a 2020 bulletin on cold case best practices, highlighting how one preserved swab solved a double murder nearly 5 decades later. The arrest also reignited discussion about mandatory DNA collection laws. Broadnax's earlier crimes predated modern sampling rules. Only later convictions had placed his DNA in the database. Lawmakers pointed to the case when arguing that expanding collection to older offenders could identify long-hidden killers. Remembering the victims. In 2022, a small memorial was held in Virginia Beach. Detectives, city officials, and several members of the victims' extended families gathered near 19th Street, close to where the old Sea Pines Motel once stood. The original building was gone, replaced by apartments, but the city placed a modest plaque on a nearby public walkway. It reads, "In memory of Janice Pietropoula and Lynn Seathala, taken from their families on June 30th, 1973. This city remembers them and honors all who never stopped seeking truth. No ceremony, no speeches, just flowers, a moment of silence, and the sound of the ocean they had come to see." The end of the case. Broadnax remained in a New York medical facility after being declared unfit for trial. Virginia prosecutors kept the indictments active, ensuring the record stood even if the court never convened. When asked whether they felt cheated by the lack of a public trial, one retired detective replied, "We didn't need a courtroom to know the truth. We needed a name." For investigators who had joined the force after 9/11 and grown up with digital forensics, the case offered a bridge to another era. They saw how investigative persistence, even without computers, had kept evidence intact. It reminded them that behind every cold file are real families, real grief, and sometimes the faintest thread that can still lead home. Looking back, the 1973 Virginia Beach double murder reads almost like a blueprint of 2 centuries of policing. The analog foundation of the 70s joined with the genetic science of the 21st century. What began with hand-typed notes ended with digital code. Between those 2 points were half a century of patience. For the people who still remember Janice and Lynn, justice didn't come with headlines or verdicts. It came quietly, in a phone call, in a file finally stamped cleared. The case reminds everyone working cold files that progress isn't always about speed. It's about preservation. Evidence doesn't forget. Time only waits for the right tool to reveal what it already knows. The beach where they spent their last day still looks the same. Tourists rent umbrellas, children run through the surf, and few notice the bronze plaque tucked by the walkway. But under that sun-bleached metal lies half a century of persistence, science, and the belief that even the oldest questions deserve an answer. Because sometimes justice doesn't die. It just waits.